Hey everybody, welcome back. We've got an interesting speaker to look at today. This is a vintage classic JBL 4311B. Variations of this speaker were widely used back in the day. Some were even used for mixing or mastering in studios. There's a big following for these things. There's a lot of nostalgia associated with these. There's a cult following over some of the vintage JBL models. So obviously it's inevitable that these things are eventually sent to me to see what can we do with these things. Can we bring these up to modern levels? What does it look like? Let's dive into it and let's answer some questions. Let's look at how this thing measures and look at what's here, what do I have to work with, and let's have a little bit of a talk about vintage speakers and where do they fit in, and is it worth it or is it not worth it? And so let's take a look at it. And I want to start on this one by talking a little bit about the way these drivers are mounted in the cabinet. They're just surface mounted, so they're not countersunk. There's no smooth surface. There's no rounded edges. There is diffraction, 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 diffraction off of everything. So there are immediate issues that are quite obvious. The cabinet is very lightly constructed. There is little to no bracing on the inside of these things. The parts quality was fair to poor at that time. Now the stuff is well aged. The wiring is completely oxidized. The capacitors may or may not be within spec anymore. It needs help in every way. It's not even a comparison to a modern speaker in many ways. So is it going to be worth it to do something to it? Let's look now at the measurements on this thing and let's see what did this thing really do? What were the actual measurements of this speaker? And this is measurements of the speaker right now. Now back in the day, maybe it measured a little bit better in some ways, but the typical measurements do not change much with age. I know capacitors can drift a little, plus or minus a few percentage one way or another, or possibly if there was ferrofluid in a voice coil around a tweeter, that might thicken up a little bit over time and lose the output capability or things like that. So there's some subtle things that can happen. And I noticed on this model and on the 4311 Model A something or another that we did already, we've done a kit for one of these. The tweeter had no output really above 10 or 12 kHz. It just dropped off like a rock, and the same was the case for this one. And so the customer ordered some brand new tweeters. There's a company that makes these exact tweeters, and we were able to drop that in there, and it had a little more extended top end, and we used that to design a whole new crossover for it. And we've done some stuff for it that took this up a lot of levels. So let's look at the Model B version of this thing. And the way I want to look at this is I want to look at the measured frequency response, and then right below it, let's look at the spectral decay so that we get a kind of a comparison of what's going on here. So this first measurement was done on woofer axis because it's turned up this direction. So you think, well, the reference axis they want you on, it's on the woofer axis. So this is the frequency response on the woofer axis, the way it was adjusted, the way the customer had it as far as the controls. That's another thing that goes bad on these things in a way. They're not really bad. They gunk up and they eat up resolution and sound quality. And that's these variable pots that are on this thing that bring the levels up and down. It was very commonly used back in the day, but those things kind of gunk up and oxidize too. They just suck the life out of everything. So as we look at the measurements on this thing, we can see it is really, really rough. We see a lot of breakup and a lot of ringing all across the top end. It's virtually unusable and unlistenable at this point. I mean, that's rough and more rough, especially looking at that spectral decay. Now, we moved down on the tweeter axis, so we've moved the microphone down to this level, and we got this measurement and this spectral decay. Notice at that level, the spectral decay is a little cleaner, and that's just because at that particular point, the diffraction isn't as bad as it was at the other point. So we know that a lot of what we're seeing isn't necessarily the drivers ringing and breaking up, but it's differences in the surface reflection off of all the other drivers and things that are not flush mounted that is causing a lot of that diffraction. And that diffraction is heard kind of as a secondary ring, and it's very harsh sounding and kind of annoying. It's not, when you see those long decay rates on there, those are big red flags. That's stored energy or reflected energy, and it's arriving late compared to the actual output from those drivers. So not good. But now as we drop to that tweeter axis again, we see that the response smoothed out a little bit because we're changing the time arrival aspect between the drivers. So we've got big spacing vertically, and we've got, of course, the tweeter in the mid space horizontally on the baffle. So as you move in any direction, you're changing the time arrival from one driver to the next, and then it may be in a position where the drivers are out of phase. They're not summing anymore, or they're canceling each other because they're out of phase and creating a big hole in the response. So those are all major difficulties and tough stuff to overcome when we're trying to design upgrades for this stuff. Let's look at the last measurement here. This was on the tweeter axis, which was the best measurement we could get, and we adjusted these pots upside down and backwards to finally find a spot where there was a reasonable response curve. So that's a pretty smooth response curve. It's choppy, but it stays within a reference range there that it would be pretty acceptable. And then, of course, you still see some of that diffraction or ringing going on in some of these areas that's still pretty rough. And again, that was as good as we could possibly make it, and that was turning the tweeter level almost all the way up and turning the mid level almost all the way down. So you can just imagine what we're having to go through to create that response. And then as you move up or down, some of that changes. So we're really only adjusting it at this axis. If you moved left, right, up, or down, that whole response goes all over the place, and then you'd have to change it some more to try and balance it out for that location. And you're still only turning the amplitude levels up and down. You can't fix the time arrival aspects where the drivers are arriving out of phase. So, and then to further complicate things, let's look at the different measurements in different directions. Let's start by looking at let's look at the horizontal off axis, and let's put horizontal off axis moving to the left and horizontal off axis moving to the right. Well, for you guys, I guess it's the opposite way. It's moving to the left and moving to the right if you're looking straight at the speaker. So let's look at those two together and notice how much the frequency response changes. And again, this is on the tweeter axis as you move left or right. The red line is the same in each measurement. That's on axis. The orange line is just moving off axis 10 degrees. And then the yellow lines are moving off axis 20 degrees. You can see at those points there's significant changes in the response. Green line is moving off axis 30 degrees, and the blue lines are moving off axis 40 degrees. And you can see as you get further off axis, the output levels of those things just drop off. I mean, you have to stay dead on these things to maintain any kind of reasonable response. Also, the vertical off axis. This is at tweeter axis and moving up. That was the best vertical off axis. If we started at the woofer axis and moved up, it was a major catastrophe. Like, there were just humongous holes in the response. But on tweeter axis, moving up, this is 4 inches per measurement. You look at the red line again on axis, and then the orange line is moving up just 4 inches. So you notice it moved quite a bit, just going up 4 inches. And then the yellow line is going up 4 inches again. Notice now there's a complete cancellation in that one range there that you can see. And then the green line is moving up another 4 inches. And now it's those drivers have gotten completely out of phase, and now they're rotating back to in phase at those wavelengths, but out of time. So it's arriving in phase, but out of time. In other words, it's probably a wavelength behind, but it's not canceling. So the sum average doesn't look that bad, but it's out of phase. Now, looking at the impedance curve, we can tell from the impedance curve, the crossover was basically designed based on electrical parameters. Electrically, it's a nice smooth balance, but acoustically, the response is pretty rough. So, what to do, and I have these vintage speakers sent in quite a bit now. I have a big Cerwin Vega that we just did an upgrade for. I'll shoot a video of it pretty quickly here. I had another guy come in this morning asking about a vintage Schnell speaker, and my response is the same always as far as, is it worth it to upgrade some of these vintage speakers? It's up to you to decide that. Is it worth it? Now, you have to think about several factors here. Can we make it better than it ever was? Absolutely. I guarantee you 100% we can make it sound better than it ever was. We can balance out the response. We can put parts quality that is significantly better than what was available back then, and parts that are matched so that your left and your right are the same. Wire that's not completely oxidized. And if you look in these vintage speakers, you just strip some of the insulation off the wire, and it's brown, or it's partially green in there. That wire is really oxidized. So just new wire. Get those old binding posts off of there, or the push-on connectors, or spring-loaded connectors that you slide wire into and stuff like that. Get that stuff out of the signal path and put some tube connectors on there, so you've got a good copper connection. There's a lot of little things we can do that obviously is going to make a lot of difference. You can add some bracing to the box. You can line this thing with no res, and you can keep the box from resonating and buzzing and going crazy. Now, there's a cost involved in doing all of that as well. There's a 3-way crossover that we've got to design for this thing. We may have to go in and put notch filters in certain areas to damp out some of that areas where you're hearing ringing or diffraction. What we're doing is damping it out and turning it down a little in that area to compensate for some of that stuff. That's additional parts as well. That's an LCR network in shunt, and sometimes we have to put an LCR network in series. So it involves some parts. It involves sheets of no-res. That stuff adds up. A lot of these vintage speakers, you could spend $700 to $1,100 with an upgrade on these things. Is it worth it, though? Well, you have to ask yourself. First of all, is there a nostalgia associated with it? Or is there an emotional connection to the speaker? Was it the speaker that you had in college? Was it your dad's speaker? Is there some reason that you want to keep it and you want to restore it? And all of those reasons are good reasons. There's nothing wrong with taking a vintage speaker and saying, this is sentimental to me, and it means something to me, and I want to restore it, and I want it to sound better than it ever did, and I want to listen to it. There's nothing wrong with that. And we do these things all the time, mainly for those reasons. And some of them turn out quite well. A lot of those Pioneer HPM models, man, we got those things to measure really well, and those were significant upgrades. The old Yamaha RS 1000 model, there's a lot of those out there. People really love those speakers, but they're really bottlenecked by the guts that are in there. The upgrade takes them up big time levels. And most of the vintage speakers that we work on like this, the upgrade is usually very significant. For one, we're able to do things that they couldn't do back then. We have tools that they didn't have back then. We can put accelerometers on here and see exactly where the cabinet's resonating. We can look at spectral decays and things and see where stored energy is that they couldn't see back then. Just taking basic measurements and understanding what it's doing and making corrections that just wasn't available at the time when some of these vintage speakers were designed. So we can easily go in and make corrections and things like that to improve them. And then, of course, the parts quality is a huge factor, you know. So can we do it? Absolutely. Is it worth it? I can't say that it's worth it for everybody. For a lot of people, it's not worth it. And there's people out there that collect vintage speakers and they want them in the vintage state. They want them exactly how they were from the factory, and they collect them. They don't necessarily listen to them other than they want them in functioning order. You know, they want them to be able to play. But as far as being an audiophile type speaker, and you're going to set these things up and create a sound stage that's deep and layered, and you know, a lot of the things that we strive for today, these old speakers just aren't going to do that. So you have to kind of weigh that out. Is it worth taking that money then instead and just building one of our kits and just stepping way past the performance level of the vintage speakers? Absolutely. I mean, that's a good option, especially when there are things that we just can't get around. Like on these speakers, we can't fix the fact that this overhangs the drivers all the way around. There's going to be diffraction. We can't fix the fact that there's two drivers mounted horizontally to each other. And as you move left or right, as you saw in the measurements, they start canceling each other out. The output levels just start falling completely off. We can't really fix that too much. I mean, I can dish a lot of it more to the tweeter and less to the mid and try to get the tweeter to cover a wider range and help it in some regards that way. But it's still one of those situations where no matter which direction you move, you're going to have some cancellation. And so some of those things are just, there's no way around it. So when you compare a speaker like this that's going to inherently have all those problems to, say, a mini monitor that's just a woofer and a tweeter with minimal amount of surface area and minimal amount of surface reflections, obviously there's some significant advantages there. So for all of you guys out there, vintage gear, vintage speakers, can we upgrade these things? Absolutely. Is it worth it? That's up to you. Remember, is it nostalgic? Does it have sentimental value? You know, is there a reason you want to restore the speaker and upgrade it to higher levels? We can do it. And with this speaker, I presented this information to the owner, and my recommendation was exactly as I've explained it to all of you. If you're looking for performance for the dollar, this isn't worth it. If you're looking for something else, you know, again, you want to restore it, let's do it. It can be still a fun project for a lot of people, and it's well worth it. Most of the people who upgrade those vintage speakers contact me with huge thumbs up. Can't believe how much difference it made. They love it. They're so glad that they did the upgrade. So it just all depends on the person. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve. And you just have to figure out, is it worth it or not? If you're looking for performance only, don't buy a vintage speaker and then try and do something with it. Just start over. You know, if you want a speaker of this size, go with our Brute or a Bully. It's an old school look and feel, but it's completely modern performance, completely better parts, drivers. Everything about it is designed specifically for performance, and it measures extremely accurate. It's tough to make some of this stuff work that well because there's just too much fighting against these drivers and stuff. And like the mid-range itself, it doesn't play down that low to begin with. So you're still requiring a big woofer to handle a wide range, probably up to 1200 hertz or more. Whereas a three-way design like the Brute or the Bully, the mid-bass drivers are 5 1/4 inch drivers, and they play down to like 150, 180 hertz. So a lot of that range is being covered by a smaller, faster, lighter weight driver, and the woofer is allowed to just be a woofer. Versus in this case, the woofer is having to cover a big wide range, and this is a heavy moving mass, slow to recover woofer. So it's not even apples and oranges when you compare some of these vintage speakers to some of these newer, more modern, you know, outtakes on a vintage look or a vintage style. You know, the old school Brutes and Bullies, completely different. So just food for thought. I hope you guys appreciate this little bit of a dive into the vintage world here and talking about these things. And that's it for this video. I appreciate you guys. See you in the next video, and hit the subscribe button for me if you haven't. See you guys later.